It is decision time. Jamaica's successes must not be imperiled. The gains we have secured and the strides we have made over successive political administrations must not be reversed. Jamaica must continue to move forward into a bright, sustainable, and prosperous future. We must not go backwards. And so, as we propel to decision-making time, action time, we on this side, Mr. President, invite the Jamaican people to carefully consider what is happening, and we urge them to choose Jamaica. Mr. President, Jamaica's key macroeconomic indicators are extremely encouraging. We have heard of unemployment being at record lows. We know what is happening with respect to debt to GDP, coming in at 68.7% by end of the current financial year. Inflation is in the order of 4.7%, within the lower band of the targeted inflation range by the Independent Central Bank. Policy interest rate has been coming down. Our net international reserves are robust, essentially at record levels. We have a stable dollar, and importantly, Mr. President, notwithstanding those who would seek to decry and shout down Jamaica, the Jamaican economy is projected to return to growth in this, the first quarter of 2025 calendar year. The stability and resilience we enjoy have not come about by chance. They have come on the back of hard work, steely resolve, discipline, and responsible actions by an active and strong government. A caring government, a fiscally responsible government, a government led by the best and the most effective Prime Minister in the history of Jamaica. Even in an election year, Mr. President, we are being fiscally responsible. We are not running with it. Mr. President, there is no doubt that notwithstanding the political divide, both the Jamaica Labour Party government and the opposition PNP want Jamaica to get to the same destination ultimately. Believe it or not, even Senator Brown wants Jamaica to get to a particular destination ultimately. You're going to make less money there in that regard. Where the stark divergence emerges, Mr. President, is as to how we propose to get there. Our approach is to maintain economic stability, give dividends to the worthy and deserving Jamaican people, boost economic activity, and foster accelerated growth, and generate even more tax revenues without imposing new taxes, which will ultimately create a brighter, more prosperous future for every Jamaican, even those yet to be born. On this side, Mr. President, we are proud that we have presented 9 consecutive budgets with no new taxes. The opposition PNP purports to be committed to fiscal discipline, but it is not in their DNA. IMF imposed fiscal discipline, as we saw between 2013 and February 2016, is not the ultimate measure of fiscal discipline. True discipline, Mr. President, is what you do and how you operate when there is no big stick hanging over your head. For appropriate context as to why the hard-fought gains we have secured by responsibly managing our fiscal affairs must be protected and any risk to our fiscal discipline stoutly resisted, it is good to note where we are coming from and where the journey to where we are today started. Making his contribution as he opened the 2009-2010 budget debate on Tuesday, 23rd April 2009, Mr. President, the venerable and indefatigable Audley Manayard Shaw, in a chapter captioned Economic Framework and Initiatives to Improve Governance, said the following, and listen keenly. The Jamaican economy has a number of fundamental structural weaknesses. The good gentleman was speaking in April 2009. I'm going to start again. The Jamaican economy has a number of fundamental structural weaknesses. These weaknesses have been highlighted by the global economic crisis, but they are not caused by the crisis. In fact, they are a function of our own policies and have existed unaddressed for decades. The major weaknesses include large, persistent fiscal deficits, and as a consequence, one of the highest levels of debt in the world. This crisis provides a wake-up call to the Jamaican society. It also presents an opportunity to focus our collective efforts on addressing these issues head-on. And this is an important observation now. We have developed, Audley Shaw said, speaking back in April of 2009, a framework to address the following key reforms: controlling public sector balances and debt, rationalizing public bodies, improving central government financial management and budget processes, increasing revenue collection, increasing growth and competitiveness, managing the public sector wage bill. This reform agenda is in support of the core economic framework to which we are committed. A sound, predictable macroeconomic policy, disciplined and strong fiscal management of the economy, a tax system that is simplified and equitable, a modern labor market geared towards high levels of productivity, a simplified business-friendly bureaucracy, effective measures to prevent corruption and fight crime, and supportive infrastructure. And in a chapter captioned Debt Management, the then Finance Minister Audley Shaw said the following: the intensified engagement of multilaterals is a major component of our debt management strategy. In a short period of time, this policy produced real results. Since assuming office just over 19 months ago, this administration has sourced significant multilateral credit in both project and policy-based loans. The timing of these efforts has been fortuitous. Given the depressed state of the international capital markets, it is unlikely that these funds could have been sourced privately. Certainly, they could not have been sourced at such favorable terms. Not only have we been able to access credit at attractive interest rates, we have been able to secure longer repayment terms. To date, we have successfully negotiated a total of US $951 million in credit from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Caribbean Development Bank. End of quote. Mr. President, what caused the then Finance Minister Audley Shaw to have felt it necessary, important, instructive to say the things I quoted just now. Mr. President, the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in this country is among those things that caused him to have made the observations he made. Who among us who occupies a space in this chamber benefited from the destructive and unsustainable high interest rate policies of the 1990s to mid-2000s? Audley Shaw is in this chamber. You're a misguided guy. You are deluded. And you are delusional, quite frankly. Who is the taponaris who occupies a place in this chamber who benefited from the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in this country? When asked about the sordid, vexing, and polarizing debacle that is the financial sector collapse of the mid to late 1990s, which culminated in the creation of FinSac, opposition leader Mark Golding, instead of exhibiting contrition, instead of assuming a posture of penitence and taking the opportunity to unreservedly apologize on behalf of the PNP he leads to the people of Jamaica for ruining our country's public finances and many businesses and lives, he remarked at a PNP press conference just 2 days ago the following: I had no role in FinSac whatsoever. I was in the private sector there. I was an attorney at law, and I was involved in business as well. So you know, that was an environment that we all had to navigate as people who were in the sector at the time, and we did it skillfully enough that we never had to ask FinSac for any support. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. While the opposition leader had an "it wasn't me" moment like Shaggy, speaking at a Gleaner's editorial editors forum on his antecedents in terms of how he came to be involved in politics and the PNP, opposition leader Mark Golding, notwithstanding what he said 2 days ago at a press conference when a certain question was put to him, he said the following, speaking some time ago at a Gleaner editors forum, Mr. President. Quote, I came into the party through Dr. Omar Davies because I knew him in the financial sector, where I had been like one of the leading corporate lawyers in Jamaica and very involved in financial engineering. That's a code, by the way. And so, when he was the Minister of Finance, a lot of things that required industry input, I was one of the representatives of the industry that he would deal with. I got to know him through that, and that's how I came into the PNP. Make of that what you will, Mr. President. And I would make that same point to Jamaica. Indeed, I would commend the Financial Gleaner of Friday, December 5, 1997, to colleagues in this chamber, and indeed to the public at large. And that particular report has the following caption: FinSac to pump $85 million into Billy Craig. I'm commending that for your readership. Mr. President, critics and cynics the world over assert that one of the more unsavory features of politics and electioneering is that politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. P-R-O-S-E, prose. We have been hearing on the political platform from the opposition PNP, and more so in this process aimed at passing the 2026 budget a lot of poetry, pie in the sky promises, if you may. Their bombast, reckless and vulgar promises smack of political desperation and underscores considerable contempt for the Jamaican people. And it is a telling indicator, Mr. President, that the PNP cannot be trusted. This 2025-2026 budget exercise is of particular moment. It is of particular significance, Mr. President. That it is the last budget exercise before the upcoming general elections, which is constitutionally due by September of this year, means that the debate this time around is of added significance. What is it that the parliamentary opposition has sought to hide? Why did they not see it fit to come to the Jamaican people and present a budget that was at least costed, so that a determination could be readily made as to whether their pie-in-the-sky promises are in fact credible, achievable, and sustainable? If you are trying to sell something while holding back pertinent details regarding what you are selling, you cannot be trusted. Based on what we have seen and based on what we have heard from the PNP in the budget debate, Mr. President, they cannot be trusted. One of our more surgical and probing journalists put the following question to the opposition leader at the hurriedly called and convened PNP press conference 2 days ago. The journalist asked, "You pointed out that obviously your priorities would not be the same as the government currently in power. And certainly there are things that you don't have access to in terms of information. But clearly you should, as you see in opposition, areas where the government has put their priorities that you feel can be deprioritized to implement your programs. What would be those areas?" Mr. President, it's a reasonable question. An extremely important question. Well, the response to that question by the opposition leader was the following, and I quote, "I don't want to comment on that now, because we have to look at every line item when we come into office carefully. And there are some things that we may defer, some things that we may accelerate. There are some things that we may discontinue. And I don't want to attempt to foreshadow that yet. But I am confident that we will find the 6.4% of the $360 billion to pay for what we have come up with." Mr. President, the wild promises from the PNP are not made carefully. They were not made carefully, but in a bid to evade scrutiny and avert further public ridicule in light of how fiscally imprudent their pie-in-the-sky promises outlined in the budget debate are, Mark Golding, the opposition leader, is telling Jamaica that he would have to think carefully about what areas he would propose to deprioritize, scale down, or discontinue were he to be elected to office in this country. Mr. President, Mark Golding and the PNP are seeking to sell the Jamaican people a puss in a bag. The people should reject them. The people should reject their puss in a bag, as they, the PNP, simply cannot be trusted. Andrew Holness presented a prospectus. Mark Golding presented a puss in a bag. Mr. President, whether they want to characterize the contributions we heard from Julian Robinson and Mark Golding over the past 2 weeks as a budget presentation or a manifesto presentation, The Jamaican people are being urged to note and understand that a budget or manifesto is only as good as the degree to which it is credible. Mr. President, a budget or a manifesto is only as good as the degree to which the persons proposing it have the ability, capacity, and proven track record to deliver on it without mashing up the country. Mr. President, when the PNP now attacks us left, right, and center, as they did between January 2012 and February 2016, when they heaped just about $60 billion in new taxes on the backs of us, on our backs as taxpayers. The PNP is busy mashing up the country through destructive and unsustainable policies, including their propensity to run with it, as we witnessed throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. Mr. President, the PNP cannot be trusted. I can say it 40 times more. Mr. President, remember we have until 11 p.m. You know. Watch the right guy. Mr. President, the PNP's pie-in-the-sky promises are not credible and would imperil our country's hard-fought economic successes and bring the collective sacrifice we have all had to make over the years to naught. Mr. President, they are proposing to give up so much on the revenue side. For example, $11.4 billion from the NHT, asset tax, employment tax credit, to the extent that they propose to increase it from 30% to 40%. But what is curious, Mr. President, is that notwithstanding the considerable revenue flows that they are proposing to give up, that same desperate PNP turn around and are promising to do so much on the expenditure side. Them promising this and that and every single what's it not. They talk about a pro-box moment. Well, what the PNP is putting on the table, Mr. President, constitutes a tricks you moment. Their suite of policy proposals and how they plan to implement them and how they envisage them working, Mr. President, is simply not cogent, it is simply not coherent, it is simply not credible, and it is simply not compelling. They are proposing, Mr. President, to party with the rent money. And Jamaica cannot stand by and allow that to happen. So left the party alone. Guy yard and left the party alone. The people of Jamaica must reject the backwardness of the PNP, and the people of Jamaica, I dare say, must choose Jamaica, Mr. President. Mr. President, consequent on the PNP's massive political error in presenting pie-in-the-sky promises without appropriate costing, they have been the subject of considerable public ridicule, the kind of ridicule Lambert Brown gets every time the public sees him. Yes? So they have been the subject of considerable public ridicule. They have been the subject of considerable mockery. They have been the subject of considerable castigation. And Mr. President, they have been, the PNP that is, the subject of considerable pushback by the public. It is not surprising, Mr. President, to find that in circumstances where the proverbial light is now being shone on the PNP and its pie-in-the-sky promises, and they are now under microscope-like scrutiny. They are now being intensely interrogated. The opposition PNP, Mr. President, led by Mark Golding, they are now seeking to moderate and walk back their ridiculous pie-in-the-sky promises. They are now seeking, Mr. President, to pivot from platform bombast and wild promises, that is, campaigning in poetry, to a deliberate and tactical scaling down or walking back, if you may, of their promises in order to suppress and deflate the fiscal price tag of what it is that they have been promising. Mr. President, I suppose this is their whimsical attempt to transition from poetry to prose. Mr. President, as the opposition spokesman on education, Senator Damian Crawford, for at least a year now, has been on the political platform several times over, making certain promises regarding the provision of meals and boarding facilities at schools. Speaking at the PNP's annual conference on Sunday, 15th of September 2024, Senator Damian Crawford, yes, the same gentleman who detained us for a little over 2 hours this morning and has found it convenient to make his way elsewhere, having detained us. Yes? He said the following, and I'm quoting Senator Crawford here, Mr. President. The first thing we are going to do I'm quoting Senator Crawford here, Mr. President. The first thing we're going to do is make sure we have boarding facilities for at least 30% of our school population. And then we're going to give 1 meal per child in school. That's what he said. That was at the PNP's conference in September of 2024. Then speaking, Mr. President, at the PNP's presentation of its candidate for the Southwest St. Anne constituency on Sunday, 19th January 2025, merely a few weeks ago, Mr. President, Senator Crawford issued the following charge to vuvuzela-blowing comrades. And I quote, "On the campaign trail, I want you to remind the people that we are having an election between 1 meal per child in school and 3 meals per adult in prison. The JLP will tell you you cannot afford to give every child a meal. But when the child, they find 3 meals for an adult." End quote. Mr. President, that is what Senator Crawford said when he was in poetry mode. But now that it is crunch time, where there is a demand for the hard, unadulterated numbers, given budget season and the pending general elections, Senator Crawford and the pie-in-the-sky promising PNP, of which he is a part, has gone into prose mode, pivoting from poetry mode to prose mode. They know that the proverbial light is now being shone, and that their pie-in-the-sky promises are now under microscope-like scrutiny. So what have they done, Mr. President? What have they done as they pivot from poetry mode to prose mode? Well, I'm having diarrhea, man. Well, at a hastily called and convened press conference 2 days ago, at a hastily come on. One a.m.
Thank you.
I am so enjoying this presentation that I would like to move
for an extension until tomorrow.
Members should have heard the question. In favor? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. President, at a hastily called and convened press conference 2 days ago, after a proper shellacking from our first woman finance minister the previous day, Senator Crawford and the PNP vastly walked back the pie-in-the-sky promises they were making previously. First of all, Mr. President, in what they are now presenting, the much talked about establishment of boarding facilities for 30% of our students has suddenly gone through the window. No more talk of that. Yet, in his What Can Go So speech at party conference in September of 2024, he spoke about that. There is yet another glaring example. This is yet another glaring example, Mr. President, that the PNP cannot be trusted. Secondly, on the matter of providing meals to our students, Senator Crawford spoke to and presented costing for something entirely different from what he and the PNP have been saying for several months prior on the political platform. In a classic tricks you moment, Senator Crawford and the PNP are now pivoting from poetry mode to prose mode as the political platform promise of providing at least 1 meal per day to every child at the primary and secondary level has now gone through the window, with the PNP in an attempt to moderate the fiscal cost, now promising instead to provide a meal solution to every needy student. Tricks you again, Mr. President. This demonstrates that the parliamentary opposition is being merely expedient, politically desperate, and contemptuous of the Jamaican people. And as such, Mr. President, the PNP cannot be trusted. The people of Jamaica should reject them and instead choose Jamaica. Right, nobody now call you. You're obsessed with Carl. So suddenly, this promise of at least 1 meal per day to students at the primary and secondary levels not only pertain to an estimated 246,400 students, ostensibly the 56% facing food insecurity at a cost of 18 billion, as opposed to catering to the entire student population as they previously promised. So instead of the entire student population, they have now walked it back, Mr. President, because the light is being shone on them and they're being held. Their feet is being held to the fire. They're now scaling it back to say, well, based on the Food and Agriculture Organization study and report in recent times, the 56% of our people who are considered as facing food insecurity is essentially the target group that they're going to be using. This is a vast, yes, scaling back of what they had promised, Mr. President. But it is not surprising. Using Senator Crawford's own numbers regarding the student population, which is 440,000 students, he says, the cost of providing at least 1 meal per day to them, with each meal costing $400 based on what he has expressed, over the 190 feeding days would be a massive $33.5 billion, Mr. President. So just to be very clear, what they presented at their press conference Wednesday, this past Wednesday, was a price tag of 18 billion. But it is 18 billion because they have essentially pivoted away from what they were saying on the campaign stump, on the political platform for several months now. They were promising a free meal solution to every child in our schools. But because they have heard from the people of Jamaica and they are being lambasted all over social media and elsewhere, they have sought to scale it back. When in fact, based on the original promise, based on the original pie in the sky plan that they had, the price tag would really have been $33.5 billion. Mr. President, amid this tricks you moment, our retort is to point out to Senator Crawford and the politically desperate PNP that tricks are for kids. Mr. President, cost suppression tactics were also used by Senator Crawford and the PNP in relation to its long-promised first in the family to university proposal. To the extent that a scholarship from, and this is a key bit of analysis, Lame, so you may learn something. To the extent rather that a scholarship from the government would go a far way in removing one of the binding constraints on tertiary enrollment, which is tuition, as you can appreciate. Instead of predicating one's calculation as to fiscal costs on Jamaica's tertiary enrollment rate, it would have been more appropriate to predicate the costing on what I consider tertiary eligibility. Mr. President, tertiary enrollment has to do with those who actually go to or enroll at university. Tertiary eligibility, Mr. President, has to do with those who meet the matriculation requirements, many of whom, owing to socio-economic challenges, because they come from top and Harris households, elect to go into the world of work, with some of them ultimately going on to pursue tertiary level training at some later point in life. So just to be clear, based on the regime that currently obtains, Jamaicans require a visa to travel to the United States. Persons who hold a US visa, yes, are potential travelers to the United States. So they would be considered as persons eligible to travel to the United States. However, not everybody who holds a US visa actually travels to the United States. So it's the same concept with this tertiary student business. So those who enroll are the persons who constitute the tertiary enrollment cohort. But those who meet the matriculation requirements and could present for a space at tertiary are what I am considering the tertiary eligible. Because as you can appreciate, because of financial challenges, persons who may well be eligible may well elect not to present for a place at tertiary because they simply consider themselves as not being able to afford it. Yes? So, Mr. President, it is my information that the grade 11 cohort for the 2024 sitting of CSEC was 33,564 students. Some 11,356 of them, Mr. President, obtained passes in 5 or more subjects with math and or English, which means that they satisfied the matriculation requirement for entry into a degree program at one of our tertiary training institutions. Now, being conservative, Mr. President, if you were to add some of the persons in our society who are or who were previously eligible for tertiary level training as they meet the matriculation requirements, we could put the indicative degree training cohort at 12,000. Again, Mr. President, using Senator Crawford's own estimates and parameters, let us say just about a quarter of that 12,000 would happen to be first in their family to university, thereby qualifying for the PNP's promise. 3,000 students at the annual tuition cost of 600,000, using again the figure that he used at the press conference. So using that figure as the average cost of tertiary level training, because as we are aware, there are other programs at the university that cost well in excess of $1 million and are more expensive. Programs like medicine, of course, to the extent that it is not UGC subsidized. Programs like law at the Faculty of Law on the Mona campus, for example, and other programs like engineering and so on. But we're using the 600,000 that the goodly Trixie Senator used at the press conference. Yes? So, considering the 3,000 students who would be eligible, Mr. President, at a cost of 600,000 over the 4-year period, as per Senator Crawford's calculations, that would actually come out using these numbers at a tune of 7.2 billion Jamaican dollars, not the 3.9 billion Jamaican dollars that Senator Crawford articulated at the PNP's hurriedly convened press conference this past Wednesday. But it doesn't end there, Mr. President. It doesn't end there. The Trixie crew, the Run With It crew, the Cannot Be Trusted crew must be made to tell us what of the other costs associated with accessing tertiary education, which includes, of course, boarding and accommodation, meals, books and supplies, and laptop computer. The Trixie crew and the Run With It crew must tell us that. Mr. President, it is my considered view that all things factored, the SLB reforms articulated by the governing JLP are more fit for purpose, sustainable, and fiscally superior to the pie-in-the-sky proposal the PNP is presenting. Because what have we done with the SLB? And you would have heard other speakers touching on it throughout this debate. We're providing support via the SLB, where, of course, the guarantor requirement has been abolished. We're providing support on the tuition fee side, but we're also providing support for accommodation, meals, books and supplies, and of course a laptop computer. Because what would university life be, quite frankly, without access to at least a laptop computer? Another technical one, maybe a bit over your head, but watch this one, Lamy. We're dealing here now with deposits held by the BOJ in the banking system. You saw cocktails though. The Molotov type. I know. Don't think I don't know. Mr. President, we're jobbing and moving, man. We're nimble like Muhammad Ali, moving like a butterfly. Mr. President, Mr. President, contrary to the picture painted by the opposition spokesman on finance, there is no easy fix to the vexing interest rate conundrum we have in our country, Mr. President. This is exacerbated by what is considered by many observers and pundits in the marketplace in particular as a particularly volatile environment, having regard to the specter of tariff wars in some of the major countries around the world, or involving some of the major countries around the world. So to the extent, Mr. President, that the banking system here in Jamaica looks on at what is happening further afield in respect of this whole business of trade wars or tariff wars, it is anticipated that there is likely to be an inflation environment, or at least that is their anticipation, because tariffs will push up the cost of goods and so on. And to the extent, I'm just a teacher because, I'm being gratuitous. So, Mr. President, to the extent that the banking sector anticipates a certain inflationary impact, they may be characterized now as being in a bit of holding pattern. And so, as the central bank, our independent central bank, has reduced benchmark interest rates, quite sadly, our banks, for the most part, have not been as responsive. But how do you address this? Mr. President, going the route of direct allocation, while possible, could prove problematic and contentious, as some stakeholders and onlookers would cry favoritism and improper interventionist practice on the part of government. It could erode confidence, undermine stability in the banking system, and could prove to be counterproductive and ill-advised as a response strategy to seek to drive interest rates down. But, Mr. President, we note the PNP's proposal to leverage deposits held by or on behalf of the government of Jamaica in our banking system via what they describe as a quote-unquote competitive auction. Mr. President, I have consulted with reputable and competent economists, not some blabbermouth on radio. You know who I'm talking about, yes? And the caution, I don't parade as an economist, you know who I'm talking about. And the caution they provide, Mr. President, is that any attempt, learn this thing, my friend, any attempt to move around government of Jamaica held deposits in our banking system via competitive auction would prove highly counterintuitive and unfeasible given the stated objective, i.e., that is, we are trying to get interest rates to come down. Because remember, that is the thrust. That is the mischief we're trying to correct, Mr. President. We're trying to bring interest rates down. And we're trying to get them to come down at a faster and more commensurate pace. We're nearing the end. Yes? We're trying to get interest rates amongst the banks to come down at a faster and more commensurate pace relative to the Bank of Jamaica's policy rate. But, Mr. President, to the extent that the competitive auction system being proposed by the opposition PNP would see financial institutions competing to give the government of Jamaica the highest rate of return possible on its deposits, while at the same time have to turn around and unlend that money to their customers and clients at competitive, i.e., low interest rates. The competitive auction system being proposed by the parliamentary opposition would be counterproductive and, quite frankly, absurd. And of course, Mr. President, the PNP couldn't be out of their mind to be proposing to move around government of Jamaica deposits in the banking system via a competitive auction that actually has the effect of providing a lower rate of return on the deposit relative to where the money is coming from initially. So you couldn't move from institution A to institution B at a lower rate via a competitive auction. That would be absurd, Mr. President. But then again, we're dealing with the PNP here. So anything is possible. After all, Mr. President, they cannot be trusted. The PNP charges, Mr. President, that the JLP has not made the banking system competitive in the 9 years it has been in office. But what are the facts? How it really goes, Mr. President? First of all, the most important ingredient to stability and certainty and a positive and optimistic outlook on the future is managing the macroeconomic imperatives in the country and securing and consolidating macroeconomic stability. That's the first thing you do in your effort to drive down interest rates. You can't drive down interest rates in a topsy-turvy environment. And that is why we are being fiscally disciplined, sober, and of course, astute in maintaining macroeconomic stability. The second way to continue to drive down interest rates is through the policy rate, as I touched on earlier. The market, theoretically, takes its cue from the Bank of Jamaica. Third approach, because these things essentially work in tandem. The third is to empower customers. JLP championed loan portability, and we know how important the credit bureau is in relation to helping persons to access loans, credit, at lower interest rates. And the fourth thing, many banks currently have favorable rates, particularly to their MSME clients, based on creditworthiness. So that's one of the things we would encourage our MSMEs, for example, to focus attention on. Building relationship with their bank, demonstrating over time creditworthiness, and that should help them, quite frankly, secure more favorable credit terms, i.e. rates on loans from their financial institution. In a free market, Mr. President, the consumer is king. Citizens should be encouraged, and this platform is being used right now to encourage persons to shop around, quite frankly, and be prepared to take their business elsewhere, i.e. move their money around in search of lower interest rates in the case of seeking loans, and of course, in terms of deposit rates, you want to get competitive rates on your deposits. So, Mr. President, the PNP charges that we did not make the DBJ adjustment in 9 years. What they should concern themselves with, Mr. President, is that after 9 years in opposition, they couldn't present an appropriately costed budget with credible proposals. After 9 years, 4.5 years under their incumbent leader. In fact, the cry from Senator Crawford at the press conference was that it late, but it reached. Another couple technical matters, Mr. President. Employment tax credit. The opposition leader is quoted to have said the following, Mr. President, in relation to speaking of employment tax credit. This is an important thing because it is an incentive for employers to bring persons who are on contract work in formal forms of employment, which is an abusive measure used by some, not all. Now, Mr. President, either the opposition leader made a mistake, or a case of arrogance of ignorance rather, is in play, or it was a deliberate attempt to obfuscate and mislead, perhaps to exaggerate how pervasive this phenomenon is. Yes? As employment tax credit applies to both permanently employed persons and persons employed on a contract of service basis. I'm going to assume the opposition leader made a mistake and was really referring, Mr. President, to contracts for service as opposed to contract of service. And kindly go and research the difference. You go and research the difference. First of all, Mr. President, the court has been emphatic in pronouncing on the abusive and dishonorable practice of contract for service arrangements, which was historically being exploited, particularly by security service companies, for example. This practice should no longer be pervasive in the Jamaican marketplace, because as the court has held, once the worker is under the company's direction and control, and essentially the company supervises the person's work, the person is not in a contract for service relationship. They are essentially an employee, i.e. a contract of service. Now, secondly, and most significantly, Mr. President, to the extent, Mr. President, that the employment tax credit has been around for 10 years now, why would we not think that Jamaica is at saturation point in terms of the number of employers who actually see employment tax credit as an incentive worth their while, and as such are keen on availing themselves of the benefit? i.e. the tax credit. Mr. President, for those employers who have not yet taken up, the question is, if they didn't respond in all of 10 years, where a whopping 30% tax credit was on the table, why do we think there will be any extensive and significant take-up now? I don't know that they will find the additional 10% that the employment tax credit is being proposed to be increased by more significant than they found the 30% that it has been at since its inception some 10 years ago. In my view, Mr. President, the PNP, based on their pie-in-the-sky promise, would only be giving up revenue from business enterprises that are already in the tax net and being compliant while deriving little or no returns, given the dim prospect, in my view, of realizing any significant increase in actual take-up by businesses of the benefit to be derived from employment tax credit. Mr. President, I come now to the so-called corporate income tax relief to MSMEs. The vast majority of MSMEs, and I was speaking at an event, I was participating at an event with Julian Robinson last evening, their spokesman on finance, and he made this point. He conceded in this regard. The vast majority of MSMEs, do not turn a profit in the first few years of their operations, and as such, would not be required to pay corporate income tax. And for those that do, the profit may well be considered as anemic or negligible. Mr. President, the better approach where our MSMEs are concerned and providing relief to them are concerned is the approach being adopted by the incumbent Jamaica Labour Party government. That is, in part, the $2 billion that is being made available at the DBJ is aimed at helping our MSMEs to build their capacity, providing technical assistance, technical support to them, which will put them on a footing and increase their prospects, Mr. President, of turning a profit. And my final point. The NHD, Mr. President, the vexing issue of housing. Learn this guy. Mr. President, we're pressing along. The songwriter says press along, Saint, so we're pressing along. Mr. President, we know that attaining the dream of home ownership is one that is near and dear to many Jamaicans, particularly our young people. The Jamaican people have two approaches that they can juxtapose. They have two approaches that they can put side and side and consider which is more sustainable, which is more fit for purpose, which is better thought out, which is more practical. Mr. President, the PNP is proposing Mr. President, the parliamentary opposition is proposing a $1 billion deposit fund that will ostensibly provide some $500,000 to young people, they say, to pay down on a house, to help with their deposit, right? The PNP's suite of proposal, Mr. President, and they don't quite understand it, is on the demand side. They are approaching the challenge we have at present with respect to attaining the dream of home ownership solely from the demand side. Our approach, Mr. President, is more fit for purpose. It is eclectic. We are doing something on the demand side, but we're also coming with action on the supply side. And why am I saying this? Mr. President, what we have found in this country is that whenever the NHT loan ceiling, for example, which is a demand side action, is increased, or whenever there's any reduction in stamp duty and transfer tax and anything that helps to incentivize action with respect to the housing and construction sector, we find the market responding by going north. In other words, the price of houses, the price of housing units go up. You know it, but your opposition leaders still never come with an appropriate approach to fix it. So keep quiet. So, Mr. President, their approach to solving the mischief, to correcting the existing mischief, is to continue to throw money at the problem. And what we have observed over the years is that so soon as you move the loan ceiling, the market responds by going further and further out of the reach of prospective homeowners, or at least persons seeking to attain the dream of homeownership. And as I said just now, Mr. President, what we are doing on this side is addressing the issue on the demand side, but also utilizing the supply side approach. And what am I speaking of? The Andrew Holness-led Jamaica Labour Party government, Mr. President, is increasing the NHT loan ceiling from $7.5 billion to $9 million. We are increasing the loan ceiling for two applicants, co-applicants, from $15 million to $17 million. And we are increasing the loan ceiling for three applicants from $21 million to $23 million. And as you have heard from Senator Gale, we are reducing the threshold, or the number of years over which a person would have to wait to be able to access and become eligible for a home improvement loan. But on the supply side, from 10 years to 7 years, my friend, there's no question you can ask me that I can't answer. Understand that. So, Mr. President, on the supply side, what the government has done is to signal and give a directive using administrative fiat, the policy directive to the NHT, is that in relation to housing solutions, they are being directed to come in at 14 million Jamaican dollars. This is a supply side action. So on the supply side, if the housing unit, Mr. President, is priced at $14 million or less, the NHT borrower will be eligible, based on Andrew Holness's intervention, to a loan amounting to 12 million Jamaican dollars, bringing him closer to attaining the dream of homeownership. So that, Mr. President, constitutes an eclectic approach. We're doing something on the demand side, but because we know what happens with respect to the market, especially some of the unconscionable developers, yes? We do something on the supply side. So I am commending that. Lambert Brown and Associates Construction. So, Mr. President, with that, with those brief observations, Mr. President, I am commending the appropriations bill to the Senate. I believe that it represents well thought out policies based on what we have heard in the budget debate elsewhere in that other place. And I am urging the people of Jamaica to take stock and take note of the active and strong policies of the government, and I dare say, reject those people who are proposing and coming with uncosted, unrealistic, less than credible, pie-in-the-sky promises, and instead choose Jamaica, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Morgan. Minister? 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 You don't have any other speakers on your side?
Haven't prevailed upon.
Charlie, you have to speak, you know.
You never done as an Abka. Come
You
on.
have to speak, you know, Charlie. You can't be